Welcome to Wake, a cold reading of James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, just to hear it out loud. Join Toby Malone and TJ Young, along with some special friends, as we puzzle our way through what we once thought was an unreadable book to produce a surprisingly listenable podcast. Welcome to a bonus post-Wake episode of Wake, the podcast that gathers the believers and the non-believers together to try to make sense of the behemoth that is the book that was once on our bucket list but is now firmly ticked off since we have now fulfilled our long-held bucket list item, reading James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake out loud just once. We've done it. It's over. Although, is it ever over? I am your host, Toby Malone, joined once more by the man who's always up for new challenges, TJ Young. Hi, TJ.
Hi, Toby. How's it going?
I'm great. How are you feeling post-Wake?
You know what? I went to the bookstore and I was like, I gotta find a new book. I bought 3.
Okay.
I'm already almost done with 1, which is surprising to me because I usually read slow. You know, I usually read slow. So, and it's been a week, and I'm like, I gotta read something. And I will tell you, no novel is scratching the same itch.
Could it ever possibly? I think we'll get to talk about that a little bit today. I mean, once you've read The Wake, everything else is easy, right?
That's the thing. I was like, this is so easy.
Yeah. And so joining us today, we're talking a lot about our new reading choices today, because joining us is a special guest, a longtime listener, a great supporter of the podcast and on our YouTube channel. George Koors is here, a writer, librarian, YouTuber who's connected with us online. Welcome, George. We're so glad to have you here.
Hey, thank you folks so much for having me on. It's an honor to be here. Post reading, I feel so privileged to be here.
Of course, it's wonderful to have you here, and we've been talking for a couple of months about getting you on, but we decided to leave it till after we finished the book, just because you had some sort of specific ideas about the conversations that we could have, all of which ties into your YouTube channel that you have. So, tell us a little bit about the channel you have, which I think is fantastic.
Yeah, so I'm a novelist, and for the last 10 years, I have pretty much refused to use social media. And finally, with my partner, advice from my partner, advice from my therapist, I have decided to start using social media. And I decided to make a YouTube channel to talk about novels and just talk about novels in a little bit more depth than we see a lot of Instagrammers and TikTokers and YouTubers doing, a lot less summary and a lot more themes. Because like you folks, I'm also an academic. So I'm trying to come at these novels from that, not necessarily an academic perspective, but a little deeper, and trying to be a voice out there, kind of like you folks with the Wake Pod of, hey, let's engage in this. It's complicated. We love it. It's a great way to exchange ideas, cultures, identities, and so forth. So I decided, okay, I'll start doing YouTube videos as a way to sort of self-promote my own writing. And it's been interesting. The Wake has been important to the YouTube channel, because, a lot of people they're curious, and they come at it with a genuine curiosity because of how notorious the novel is. And rightfully so.
Absolutely, and you make it very digestible by saying, so you have a deep dive analysis of these books, but you also have books in less than 2 minutes, which is fantastic. On social media, that's exactly the right length in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I'm trying to pitch. I'm trying to elevator pitch people on engaging in the literary arts in a deeper way, which I guess is maybe perhaps a losing battle, but I'm trying to convince people like, hey, you should be reading stuff like Finnegan's Wake, because I think that high literary art is for everybody. I don't think it's this. I don't believe in this sort of gate kept situation with regard to literature and art. So it's important to me to say, here you got 2 minutes. Let me pitch you on this crazy novel that you've never heard before. And the Finnegan's Wake one, people love watching it. Just to learn a little bit about what's in between the covers.
We talk often about how a lot of literature like Finnegan's Wake, I think about when I was introduced to Frankenstein in school, right? Because it's tied to a project, you get this like repulsion to it, right? And so I think that is always our challenge, especially as academics, to be like, we love this thing. it's almost dangerous to put it on our syllabus because
Yes.
someone's going to be pushed away from the text. But also, how can we bring them into stuff that we've read out of our curiosity and hope that it piques their curiosity?
Mhm.
So I love that approach.
I think for me, coming at it is I see art as really egalitarian. And one of the reasons why I love the Wake and why I love the stuff that you folks did with the Wake, I love it because when nobody understands it, everybody can approach it.
Yeah.
And to me, that is just the thing that I love about Finnegan's Wake is I think anybody off the street, a 6-year-old could pick this book up and have a completely unique and beautiful and transcendent reading of it. That's I'm so glad to be here with you folks who are also doing that work. So thank
Yeah.
you guys for doing that.
And we found that we had a few readers who were children who read with us, and they were so open to what they were reading because they're so used to reading stuff that they're maybe not going to understand, that they're going to have to learn as they go. And we have that barrier as adults where we lock ourselves off from what's difficult, and it's really liberating to say, okay, no, we're not going to understand it, so let's let that means that we have permission to move on without having full knowledge of what the themes are, the concepts are. And maybe university breaks us of that, where you've got to write a paper on a certain thing, and if you don't understand it, then you need to continue reading, and so we give up as adults. But I find that reading like children and to go, hey, it's all new to us, or reading in translation. We had a lot of different readers who English is in their first language, and so that's a challenge too.
For sure. And I think there's something about curiosity in the process of consuming Finnegan's Wake that I think for me, with my like sort of rhetorician hat on, if I'm in the writing class from a university, I think the thing that for me is really important for a person to have as a critical reading lens is just genuine curiosity.
Yeah.
There's so much that we can do as academics that we could say, hey, look, I use this particular lens, but like the foundation of that is just being willing to say, hey, I'm curious about this. I'm going to engage it. And for me, reading Finnegan's Wake has been so interesting because I think when I was first introduced to it, I had some folks erroneously claim that James Joyce invents his own language here,
Right.
and I come from a linguistics background, so I thought about that a lot. And he doesn't, that's not true. But what the feeling is, it's as if you're reading in a second or third language, and you can just catch these snippets as they pass by, and you feel so good when you catch that sentence that Joyce has decided, hey, for some reason this is going to be in here. And every time when I open up Finnegan's Wake, and I read a page and there's a sentence that's legible, it just makes me laugh so much to out of nowhere, and it feels like this big accomplishment that kind of to me mirrors that sort of language learning that we have. And I think that it's apt to say, kids could approach the Wake really interestingly because their brains are processing language so much more intensely than ours are as adults. That it really can be really quite profound, I think. But yeah, I have to say, like, for me, when I first picked up the Wake, and I had read Ulysses, I had read most of Joyce's other works. I picked it up. The first thing I did, I bought it at a place called the Haunted Bookstore in Iowa, which is like 1,000 miles away from where I live. And first thing I did was what you folks did. I opened it up. I just read it out loud, and just to see. And I, having known a little bit about the novel, I wasn't sure. We joked about this up top. I wasn't sure if a reading of it is a reading of it, sort of philosophically. So I just let it sit on the shelf for like 15 years and just occasionally would pull it off, flip to a page, and read it. And it took me a long time to accept that I could sit down and just give it a go from tip to tail. Because I think once you get into that language, the inclination can kind of be to reject a reading that's typical, a form of reading that's typical. Which I thought was really beautiful with you folks reading it out loud with all sorts of people. I have to say, the section with all of the notes 2.2, the night lessons. when I was first introduced to your folks' podcast, that was just I immediately went there, and I think we had even texted.
Like, how did they do it?
Yeah, I immediately went there just to take a look, because as a novelist, when I'm looking at this, I'm so smitten with this. I love it. It's so weird. There's so many voices going on, and a lot of other writers do this sort of play with form inside the text, so you don't even see it, and it's just such a nice little treat from Joyce to give us these voices in different places. It's almost in a strange way, he's almost allowing us a little bit of, you would think that this is the most difficult section, and it is, but he's almost giving us a break by not combining all these voices inside the text, which I thought was really
and when we decided to produce that section, we really had to sit down and think about how we were going to manage it, because we thought, okay, it can't just be one voice or two voices. We needed to figure out how we were going to lay it out, and we sort of settled on this idea that it would be one person reading the body and one person reading the footnotes and one person reading the annotations. But then we thought that's going to leave one person with a lot to do and one person with nearly nothing to do. So we rotated, and we weren't really sure how it would work. But what it did do is that it forced us to really consider the structure of the piece and what these different voices brought to that segment. And I don't know if we uncovered anything new, but what we did do is as the three of us, Neil and TJ and I, reading this through, we sort of got a sense of this ebb and flow that comes with the interjections and the interruptions that you wouldn't really get if you tried to combine them all into a single. Say if you tried to combine them all into a single block of prose and just said, okay, it's all just one voice, so that the listener can at least hear Neil interjecting or giving a footnote, and we know that that's something else that's happening in the text. And maybe it'd be easier if you're following along. But yeah, just the fact that he's saying to us, stop, slow down, there's more to this than you think. And then, like we've also said, it's one of those things where footnotes generally are supposed to help, and in this case, they just make it harder.
And one of the things that in that section, the thing that I walked away and realized is that it forced us to make a decision that the reader doesn't necessarily have to make. It forced it to decide, this is when we're going to put this interjection. This is what we're saying it's possibly connected to. This is when you're going to interact with those footnotes. Whenever I read things, I might go to the footnotes. I might not, right? It all depends on what I feel like my needs are. And even just making those decisions for our listeners, it creates a sort of like a forced rendition, at least in that instance, of that section that is kind of freewheeling and, sporadic and allows you to do whatever you want to do. It's very much choose your own adventure in that moment. And we said, but this is the path that we want to go on because we have to try to produce this product in this way.
Oh yeah. And I think that it's so like enlightening to hear you say this is our choice, because that is something that I want listeners, if they come to this episode looking for like, okay, they've done this, what's it going to be like for me to listen to this podcast? Actually, what you just said makes it so that they should read The Wake on their own.
Yeah, 100%.
In addition, because I guarantee that every reading of that section of the homework section is so drastically different, because as you're saying, some people probably just read the errata around the edges at first and then go in, or there's so many different ways to approach it. And I think another thing that's really interesting about that section in particular, because it's very academic, is if you have a grounding in a different language, and Joyce was familiar with that language, so if you're a speaker of German or French or Spanish or Italian or Latin, you are going to probably be latching on to these other aspects of the text. And one thing, as a speaker of German and Spanish, reading through, my German is excellent. My Spanish is very poor. And I'm noticing in my own readings that like, I really gravitate to those sections where he's taking these German loan words and combining them and playing with them. And to a lesser extent with the Spanish as well. That's definitely something that's in there. And it does make me wish that I was a little bit more familiar with the French in reading a text like this. But, there's so many different ways to latch onto the text, which I I want to encourage folks as well, if they're, hesitant. I think it really is important to understand that, in that new criticism vibe of, hey, every person's reading is a reading. Joyce's Finnegan's Wake really enables that in a way that, because of his obsession with language play, a lot of other texts may not do as well. I one of the things that I always tell people about the text is, if you're typoglycemic, which is this sort of strange way of saying that you can read jumbled up words. If you're good at word jumbles, Finnegan's Wake is something that you can piece through, because there's all these intentional misspellings and words that are sort of combined strangely together and punned. It really is all over the place. But yeah, that I gotta say, as an artist, I have to take my hat off to you folks for section 2.2 though, because that was really, it was well done. It was a good job.
Thank you. Yeah.
I tell this story all the time. It was the section, because behind the scenes, we were taping that section, and the last 30 minutes of it, my internet cut out. And I was like, and we did a marathon. I want to say we did 2.5 hours, almost 3 hours, to try to record it all. And when the internet cut out and I dropped from the call, the way that I sat there looking at my computer, like, you have betrayed me. and if we have to do this again, this might break me,
Yeah. And Neil and I sat there waiting for TJ to come back, and TJ's texting me saying, my internet's out, I'm rebooting the whole house. So we're just sitting waiting as the recorder keeps ticking along. And then he finally comes back in, and then we downloaded the tracks, and his track had not saved from... So I had to individually download his track, and then when I
was like, I'm so sorry. I was like, that was the day. I was like, I don't know, Toby, but we made it.
Yeah. But it was a really interesting challenge, because I think when we first picked up this text, we looked at the first couple of chapters and thought, okay, it's narrative. And then I think the first sort of stumbling block we came to was the Mutt and Jute conversation in book 1, where we went, oh, okay, there's a play here. And then and then later in 1-2, where we have the Ballad of Percy O'Reilly, and we went, okay, how will we do that? And just happens my wife is a musician, and so we're able to manage that. But then we just kept seeing these challenges ahead, and everyone we would talk to would say, yeah, but how are you going to do 2-2? How are you going to manage that? And then once we had conquered that, I was talking to Richard Hart at one of his recordings of One Little Goat's version, and that was the first question I asked him: "How are you going to handle 2-2?" And his eyes bugged out, and he's like, "I don't know." And they'll figure it out. They'll do very well. They're smart. But yeah, you've got to handle it in your own kind of way, with the real realization there's no such thing as definitive when it comes to this. And there can't be a definitive version, even though there are great recordings out there, 28-hour recordings that exist. There's a speed reading recording that exists. There's all these different versions which have been recorded by excellent Irish actors. But even that is just one rendition of an infinite number of versions. Which is why we always fight against the idea that the Oxford World Classics tell us that this is the definition of what happened in this chapter. And you go, well, that's one perspective.
Yeah.
That leaves out all the funny and sexy bits.
Right. Yeah. I think one of the things I'm always telling folks about the Wake, when they want to get into Finnegan's Wake, and I have a couple of other novels I'll recommend later and when we're talking, but I do this with a few different novels, which is, there are some literary works out there that you have to suspend your obsession with reading comprehension with. And that is so counterintuitive, especially, where I'm coming from in the United States. You are drilled as a child, did you read this correctly or not? And it is very binary. And I know a lot of readers have a lot of trouble relinquishing that power to the author and saying, okay, I'm going on your journey, whatever that journey is. And I know that, some other, Gravity's Rainbow is a great example of this. The prose is very dense, and a lot of folks are trying, word by word, trying to figure out what is the meaning here, what's the underlying thing. And sometimes you just have to let the river of life pass you by, and that's a metaphor that's very apt for the Wake, because you just have to let the river keep flowing. And you guys are talking about 2-2 being this hectic situation for you. Meanwhile, I read it twice. I was in love with it. I'm sitting in a cafe. I'm drinking a glass of wine. I'm just sitting there laughing to myself, having a good time. Everybody else at the cafe is like, "What's this weird guy with the beard doing here?" And it is really one of those things where if you're willing, again, going back to that, like if you're genuinely curious, there's so much to get out of Finnegan's Wake that I think is really astonishing, and it's really beautiful too. I think prose like this can seem like why would there be any beauty in here, and then you start reading about Anna, or you start reading in the washerwomen section, and you're just like, wow, this is so beautiful and so human, that it can be really, really transcendent. Yeah. So I definitely, for me, it's, trying to accept that I am what I am, and the reading is the reading. So I appreciate hearing you guys say that. That's really, really excellent.
Yeah, and I think that discovery of the beauty in the language is the thing that really kind of caught me off guard, right? Because at the beginning, it feels like you're mentally fighting for your life. The second that you can relax into it is the second that these little gems pop up, right? And my book is covered in just sections that I've circled or things that I've underlined, and it's just like the turn of phrase is so smart and so intelligent, and it actually bums me out to know that a lot of people think that this is so unapproachable and that they will never get to experience those turns of phrases, right? End of thought. It's just
one thing I think is wonderful. I mean, just in that sense, to go back to the point you made earlier, George, about picking it up off the shelf and just sort of looking at some random page. I love the fact that Joyce tells us from the very first word of the very first chapter that you're meeting us midstream, and that you're not starting at the start. And so we're so drilled into this idea, this educational idea, that you start on page 1 and you finish on page 500, and you have to read it in that order. The page order is the structure. And of course, if you want to follow a narrative along a linear path, then of course you have to do that, because if you go and start on page 300 of any other book, then you have not been introduced to characters, you don't understand what situation is you're in, and you're not going to get the full weight of what the author was trying to do. But Joyce doesn't care about that. The story starts in the middle of a sentence, and when you get to the end of the final sentence, you carry on back into the previous one, which is why so many people we've spoken to, particularly people who have been sitting with this text for many, many years, Neil Koshland-Meyer, Peter O'Brien, people like that, who have been pulling this text off the shelf regularly for 40 years and opening it up and just finding a phrase that you can identify something about your life that day, or something that stands out to you today that didn't stand out to you 10 years ago because the phrase wasn't relevant to you 10 years ago. But it's the fact that you can kind of disrupt this learned behavior of how we're supposed to read, starting at the start and ending at the end, when you can just jump into the middle. And you almost want to say to a reader, don't start at the beginning. Doesn't matter. Start in book 3 and go from there. But we had that real, I mean, we're guilty of it here in this podcast, this sense of completion. Oh, I have to finish Finnegan's Wake. But really, I think the biggest challenge is not to finish Finnegan's Wake, it's to persist with Finnegan's Wake. I think that's the challenge, because finishing it suggests that you've understood it and you can move on now. And I don't think anyone gets there.
Yeah. I think, speaking as a novelist, I think one of the biggest reasons why I love Finnegan's Wake is because it's a commentary on how art sticks with us. Just having this object, I think anybody who loves literary art should have a copy of Finnegan's Wake that they just periodically open up and page through, because it allows you to be reminded of how a novel sits with you. And it can be really daunting to find what in a narrative is really important to us. And there's a lot of white noise. There's a lot of chatter, and who are we going to listen to? What critics are valid to us? Who gets to have criticism? Who gets to have that power? It's a fraught conversation, to say the least. And there's a lot of intercultural interchange that goes there. There's a lot of philosophy that goes in there. But at the end of the day, you're a person who has the ability to read or the ability to listen, and you are engaging in a text. And I think that is just, for me as a novelist, it's one of the most salient and important lessons I've ever learned, is like when I write a book and I share it and a person reads it, I might have some grand conception. Hey, this is what I want my art to be. And there might just be some little important thing that day that sticks out in the text to that one person, and forever that's what they associate with that text. And it's really beautiful. It's almost like mindfulness of, even though everything's unique and nothing, there is no like unifying factor to it. There is that beauty that you can find. And I just, I come to that every single time with Finnegan's Wake. I try to use it as a reminder for myself. And that's one of the reasons why I love pulling it off the shelf as a reading strategy. When I went through and I did it, from tip to tail, I kind of had your thought of, well, should I start with River Run, or should I just open to a page and just loop, mark the page and loop back to it? Which I probably will do next time. I think next time I read it, from tip to tail in that sort of scenario, I think I'm going to just pick a page and go from there. Cause I do think, like you say, it's flexible in that way. It allows us to engage in that sort of freedom, which is pretty unusual for a novel. So definitely something I'm looking forward to on that.
Yeah, I mean, the way that we met was on Instagram, and it's in this sort of phenomenon that I'd never really engaged with before, because I was never really engaging with literary work on social media. I don't use social media personally, but we set up the Instagram for my previous book that I wrote that it was, just to promote it. So when we started doing this podcast, I thought, well, we'll have an Instagram account because that's the easiest way to do it. And so I sort of stumbled across this phenomenon, which has been going on for years, but I had never really acknowledged it, which is this Bookstagram idea. There's also BookTok. There's also, all the book YouTube channels, things like that. The fact that we've got this new way of engaging with literature, and you're engaged and you're part of that community of the fact that we have people who are curating Instagram profiles to focus on their reading achievements or focus on the most recent book that they've come across. There are the TikTok side of things is interesting, just because it tends to become more about body count than it does about actually engaging with the text. But
Instagram is guilty of that as well.
And so just can you tell me a little bit about being part of that literary communities on social media? Like you said, you resisted it for a long time, and now you're in there. How do you find that world?
I resisted it for a long time because I think, I had this romantic idea about, art and the literary arts and the way that we connect, as artists. And in part of that was when I was going through school and sort of coming of age, I was really privileged to have friends who made art. I had a lot of friends who made music. I friends who are deep in theater. Who I have friends who are poets, and it was just very lucky for me to have that. And it got to a point where you sort of start to wonder, how am I going to promote this? And my debut came out 10 years ago. Always the Wanderer came out in 2015. And at that time, I didn't have any interest in promoting. I didn't have any interest in social media. And I just kind of let it be. And there was a lot going on with me personally that was kind of difficult to go through at that time. And promoting the writing definitely took a back seat to a lot of things in my personal life. And I got back to it, and I got some manuscripts written, and I started talking to agents, started talking to publishers, and sort of tried to decide, how am I going to go about this? And when I was querying, I found that literary agents were asking for, how many Instagram followers do you have? How many TikTok followers do you have? And I was not very pleased with that. I was a little disappointed. So I just started lurking around and watching how people interacted. I started looking around to see, is there a little space here that could fit, for what I'm hoping to accomplish with this. Um, and eventually I found, some groups on Instagram of folks who were engaging with literary art as readers. And then I found a lot of independent presses who were engaging with their readers via social media. So to me, I was heartened by these small presses, because something like Finnegan's Wake would absolutely not be published today by any of the top 5 publishers. Not even, there is no chance. No big corporation would touch something like this. It would absolutely be some, tiny little press somewhere that's 1 or 2 people. And I just said, okay, you know what? I'll go for YouTube. Try to make it a little bit more substantive. Try to center myself as a writer and as a thinker, and share that. And it's been interesting. It's been an interesting networking experience that is not always my favorite. I'm not going to lie. I mean, we're dealing with a lot of dynamic issues when it comes to promoting literary arts and social media, and one of them is a developing trend that literary arts are a sort of privileged status symbol, and possessing a lot of books is a status symbol and is something that people strive to spend money, so that way when you come over to their house they have all these stacks that make them look intellectual or whatever. And at the same time, there's unknown writers out there who are doing, carrying on the tradition that Joyce was in of experimenting with the word, and they are sharing their work with small presses, and that is primarily being shared on places like Instagram and YouTube. I can't speak much for TikTok. I use TikTok a little bit, but I'm pretty, pretty hesitant to get into too much more. I don't use X. I know on Twitter there's a huge, discourse between all sorts of different folks. And at the end of the day, it ended up being one of those things where it was a necessity. As a novelist, I had no choice.
Right.
If I wanted to connect with people outside of a university, outside of university or school, there was really no choice. And you can work at a university and the literary arts are completely overshadowed, especially in the United States. We have such a hyperfixation on STEM. We have so much overfunding of STEM and so much, such a lack in the humanities, that it can be really disheartening. So I made a deal with the devil, and we'll see how it works out. I don't know. I have a new book coming out soon. We'll see if that helps. I'm not sure. Maybe check back in with me later, but we'll see. I don't know.
But it is a really wonderful kind of surprise to find this community and to go, oh, there are people here who are very interested in literature and very passionate about it and are very open to engaging with what other people are recommending and are recommending their works, and it becomes this little cottage industry of kind of a grassroots kind of groundswell of getting this material out there. And we didn't expect to become part of Bookstagram. That was never really the intention. But we were embraced by people in that community who went, oh, you're talking about a book. I love that book. Let me promote that book. Who would have ever known that we would have found all these people? Because we were just trying to get a few clicks on the podcast. And if you go back to the beginning of our Instagram page, we didn't start until we were well into book 2, I think, because I didn't even think of it when we just started the podcast. But suddenly we had an audience, so I thought, I should promote it here.
Social media is always this slippery slope with anything artistic. I think about the visual artists who post their things on Instagram. I was like, and part of me is like, I understand you got to promote, but you kind of gave it away. Especially if you took a photo of the painting, people can now just take the photo of the painting. But also, like, my favorite bookstore here in Pittsburgh, White Whale. I love that store, but the second you walk in, there's like a BookTok section. Like, these are the top 25 books that are going around on social media. I would be lying if I said I haven't grabbed a book from there, right? Because I'm like, okay, sure. And then I think about this other bookstore that I go to down the street from me on the way to work, and they don't have that. And even just walking in, I'm like, okay, what is everyone reading?
Yeah.
because now I've like used that as a barometer. And then as a playwright myself, Toby has heard me say I would get rid of Facebook today if I didn't feel like if I didn't have to advertise my own work. But I was like, I do. It is this slippery slope. And we've often talked about the fact that Finnegan's Wake would not be published today. We often talk about the fact that also Finnegan's Wake feels like a publication by an author who earned it, and while James Joyce was absolutely ridiculed for it, I think that if this was someone's first novel,
Oh yeah.
They would have been like, yeah, no one's touching this. No one's touching you.
Although I wonder, do you think that if, just hypothetically, do you think that if Finnegan's Wake 2, The Reawakening, written same number of pages, the same, but it was written and published today by Taylor Swift, then they would publish it because, people would buy anything.
Well, Taylor Swift wouldn't have written it because she would have had a ghostwriter.
Maybe
that's important. Yeah, that's important because and I think one of the consolations I have about social media and interacting with you guys and other people on social media is this is kind of reverting back to a pre-corporate methodology where we have our small groups and we don't have our salons anymore, but we have our small groups where we interact and we exchange our literature. These big hulking corporations are sort of separate, and the reality is that somebody who is corporately funded, I don't think a piece of art like this could come out of that, because Joyce is suffering poverty. He's having so many issues. His work is like hardly published in his lifetime. And even though, yes, it was published by what are now huge publishers, they weren't like that back then.
Yeah.
And, earned it is a great phrase. I think Joyce was still hungry. I think he was still thirsty for it. I'm reading these sentences. I'm like, this man was out there every day thinking about this. And that to me is art I love. I love that. And absolutely, of course, he was ridiculed by his own brother over Finnegan's Wake,
Absolutely.
And, that's one of those things where that's another thing as a novelist is important to me is seeing these really famous folks who really had a difficult time of it, but stuck to their art.
Right.
And that's important to me, and that it's so hard, I think, navigating what is self-promotion, what is selling out, what is all these things, at least in the States, we don't have as much of like a ridiculing sellouts anymore culture. But in the 90s, if you sold out, you definitely would be, telling somebody like,
sure.
hey, maybe you shouldn't do this ad for Subway or whatever.
Right.
And it's difficult, but I appreciate, I think, that aspect of social media where folks are in each other's DMs in the intellectual way of, hey, wait a minute, I also have heard of this. That's super cool. Like, what's your take on that? So,
and I love the fact that, because there's two different sides to it. There's one with you as an active author who's trying to move some units of a current publication. That totally makes sense. But then there's a secondary side, which is books promoted by Instagram influencers that are well established, of maybe classics, sort of going back to something like Dostoevsky or in any of these these authors, and saying, let's reconsider this 80-year-old book that you didn't think you knew anything about, or here is my new take, here is how I get new readers in. And that's what I love about your channel, is that you're saying, I'm going to give you a 2-minute summary of this book, and if you're interested in more, then you can watch my 40-minute longer deep dive where we're going to go through bit by bit and make it kind of palatable for a new reader. And so what you're getting, I think the BookTok thing, I came down initially cynically on it when I was at library school. The only reason I have a TikTok account is because we all had to sign up for TikTok and then search for BookTok. And there is a lot to be cynical about, because you go, well, a lot of these are paid promotions, or a lot of these are 14-year-old girls who are more about the aesthetic of the front cover than they are about what's in there. But at the same time, these kids are now reading. It's hard to fight something that generates interest in a book. And if it's then generating an interest in something like Finnegan's Wake, and you have people who maybe watch your video and then go, actually, that sounds interesting, I'm going to try it, then that's a win in my book. So, I mean, how did you come up with those summaries? How do you approach getting someone interested enough to take a risk on something that they thought was impossible?
To me, this is just an idealistic devotion to art. I believe in it. I really believe in it, and I think I'm super cynical. I actually am still very cynical of social media, and if I was suddenly able to get rid of it, I would. I love how much I'm connecting with people, but at the same time, it's run by a corporation. It is all this giant company, and we're just making money for them. Um, and I can't divorce myself from that cynicism. But what I can do is say I have this enthusiasm that I want other folks to engage in art. I don't care who they are. I don't care where they're from. That's just the thing that I want in life, is to see folks, have that moment where they find that beauty. So what I do, like a little peek behind my screen on the YouTube channel, is I, take a lot of notes on what I'm going to talk about in the deep dive, and I record the deep dive first. And basically, after I record the deep dive, I take a beat to sort of say, okay, what did I talk about a lot? What do I think, was really salient in that sort of self-guided discussion that I'm taking people on? And I try to condense that down as quickly as possible, without necessarily sacrificing that deeper level. Because I think one thing that people thirst for is really complex art. And I think Bookstagram or BookTok or Book YouTube, all of these, film YouTube, and it goes into, theater and the physical arts as well. The presence of these things on social media invites fakers and posers, without a doubt. But it also shows us the ubiquity of a love of art and how human that is. And every time I run into somebody new, it does soften that cynicism a little bit in my heart, that this is just all for Mark Zuckerberg or whatever. But at the same time, people have to connect. And if social media didn't exist, I don't know, maybe I'd be out at the community center or something, trying to interface with people there. But at the end of the day, those 2-minute videos is just, hey, why don't you try and love some art?
Yeah.
Here's some options. Maybe you don't love it. I don't know. Maybe I didn't love it. Maybe you'll love it. Because to me, the sharing is caring. Sharing is the goal that I have with that. And that's something that in an academic setting is really difficult to achieve, because we're so deeply engaged in discourse.
Yeah.
And that's so fraught by funding and what your department wants and what your university wants, to the point where, I've had a great time teaching. I've enjoyed that. But it's really hard to get your love of the art in the syllabus. So eventually this was the compromise. The devil's bargain, as I call it, was, okay, I'll do the YouTube channel. Because I don't think I could I tried TikTok, I've got some videos on TikTok, but it's the artifice I don't understand. YouTube, I at least have a little bit of a better understanding personally of. Podcasts, I don't know. The YouTube channel is a little bit similar to a podcast. I flip through the book sometimes and show people stuff, but podcast is another, sort of place that I don't really know, how does this work? How do I put it together?
It's interesting that you said it's really hard to infuse the love of the art in the syllabus, because I agree. And where I teach it's very much about creating individuals that will go and work in the industry. Yeah. Right. So a lot of times I'll be like, we're going to read the script, we're going to analyze the script. And sometimes I have to enter that conversation and be like, and you're probably gonna hate it. But like sometimes for me, it is like, I'm teaching you the skill of how to engage with this, even though you hate it. Right. Yeah. Which I think is a valuable tool, even when you're approaching novels, that, figure out the reason why you put it down after 3 chapters. Like, don't just like really think about, you know, your decision behind it and what that means for you and the type of art that you're seeking, right? But for a lot of this, I'm like, hey, you're going to be assigned to do a show in Iowa one year, and you're not going to like the script, but guess what? You still have to show up and you have to do it 8 times a week. So, like, how do you find a way in?
Yeah.
But even I remember, you know, in undergrad when I was getting my creative writing degree, I remember coming into contact with Gulliver's Travels, and just for some reason, where I was in my life, I was like, this ain't the one, you know, this ain't for me, right? And I remember my teacher looking at me and saying, like, you know, these are all the reasons this book is important. And I, you know, in my pompous little 19-year-old way, was like, okay.
Yeah.
But the thing that I wished that I had gotten, which is what you provide, is this sort of, I'm giving it to you, take it or leave it, right? You can engage with it as you want to. I think part of me was just being rebellious and being like, you're saying I have to engage with it, therefore I'm not going to.
Yeah.
But there's such value in saying, here's everything I think you need to make a decision if you want to go in or not.
Yeah. Yeah, and I also think, just to jump off that question of the syllabus and the bringing in things you love, because I taught theatre history and dramaturgy for such a long time, and I'd always bring in plays that were important to me. And then I would always have to wrestle with the students who went, I hate this play sucks. And you go, I'm sorry, but in no universe does Annie Baker's The Flick suck. But if you don't get it, that's a whole other conversation. But having to sort of swallow your pride and go, oh, the thing that's really important to me, like the challenge of being able to bring up, like I taught a script analysis class once where we spent 3 weeks with Ibsen's Ghosts, and I was like, guys, we're going to hang out in this play that you don't like because this is an important play. And they were like, why is it important? And you go, it is important because of all of these things that were very important at the time, and we're learning about the world at the time, and now it doesn't seem like anything. And I think that's a lot of what this classic Instagram book work is doing, is it's saying, let's figure out why this is important. Why has this stuck around? Why is this still influencing people today? Because something can be really influential at the time and fade away. Look at the plays of Ben Jonson. We don't perform them anymore because they're not influential anymore, because they're not relevant to our society. There's a reason for that. Whereas if you have a book or a play or something like that can last for generation after generation, even for centuries, that is remarkable. And we have to go back and go, okay, well, why was it important then and why is it important now? And I think your channel's giving us a lot of that too.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer that if a book lasts, it stays in the zeitgeist for more than 10 years. Like you've done something, wondrous now.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I think that question of longevity is like so complicated and so fraught because there's so much power in that question. And bring it back to Finnegan's Wake. I mean, one of the things that Finnegan's Wake does is it makes it so that nobody understands it, and that's so powerful. And I don't know if Joyce understood how powerful that was in the moment. I think it's possible, considering the way that we see his previous works sort of coming to be, but it's really quite challenging. One of the things I'm also seeing right now with how sort of literary discourses are happening, and I don't know quite where to ascribe this, but the way that people are hyping up books is really interesting to me. And there's a few that people are hyping up that are sort of reviving, an interest, and I'm a little surprised at some of that I see. I see, because I read in German, I see some German authors pointed out on social media that I would not really have expected, that probably weren't read very much in the initial publishing, and here 100 years later we're talking about them. Just very interesting to me. And a couple of those, I brought a few novels with me that I might, if folks really loved Finnegan's Wake, I brought 2 novels with me that I might posit. One I posit happily, the second I posit unhappily. So if you don't mind, I'll start with the unhappy one, if you guys are okay with that. So I'm gonna grab this. This is a podcast, so you folks can't see this, but you guys are going to be able to see this gigantic book that I'm holding.
Oh, goodness.
This thing weighs, I think, about 10 kilos. I've never actually weighed it. It is prohibitively expensive. I am circulating a petition right now to have a smaller edition printed. And this is Zettels Traum by Arno Schmidt, which has been translated into the English as Bottom's Dream. This, you guys can see it on the video, but they can't. The listeners can't see it. This book is gigantic.
It's like it sounded. You gave the sound of lifting a husky infant when you picked it up.
I think it might be 25 pounds.
Golly.
And it is completely unreadable. It has this. It's like if the entire novel was like 2.2, section 2.2. It has these comments and errata all over it. It's largely in German and it's absolutely gigantic and huge. And it was in large part inspired. Schmidt was in large part inspired by Joyce and Finnegan's Wake, and sort of attempted his go at it. The problem with, and the reason why I recommend this unhappily, first and foremost, is money. If you read Finnegan's Wake and you're like, okay, what's next? You will probably find somebody on the internet, very possibly myself included in that, who says, hey, Zettels Traum is an option. You can read Bottom's Dream. The problem with that, and this is something I always mention on the YouTube channel, is that it's prohibitively expensive. In my edition in the original German is expensive. The translated editions are even more expensive. So they did a very limited run. I think this cost me $300 or $400 when I bought it, 15, 20 years ago. The English translation, which came out much later than that, now I've seen it, sold used for $1,000 on the internet.
Golly.
It's completely unacceptable. So I'm going to take this time to say, if you go to my YouTube channel, you will find a video there where I am pleading with the original publishers, S. Fischer Verlag and Surkamp Verlag, to publish a smaller and more affordable, under €50 edition in the original German. It's been a controversial thing that I have brought to communities. There's communities on Reddit that are very supportive of Arno Schmidt's writing. And when I said, hey, this is gatekeeping, it caused uproar. There were some folks who were we had very long, difficult discussions about, is it able to be printed cheaply? Are we able to, do this in a way? And Schmidt himself was actually a little bit of a cantankerous man. And I think at the time when this novel was initially being circulated in the original German, a rogue press, I think in Berlin, printed some illegal copies for cheap, and it really made him angry.
Oh gosh.
But
So
if you're looking for something,
prices.
yeah, they were doing it out of love of the art. But if you're rich and you want to read a book that is really confounding, like section.
But the interesting thing, you say it's unreadable, but is it unreadable in the same way that the Wake is unreadable? In that it's because it's obviously another dream sort of analysis, and so is it unreadable? Is it willfully unreadable, or is it literally unreadable? I mean, I'm just sort of
Right now, it is physically unreadable.
Right.
Just because it's so big, to me, you could read it.
Right.
I think the experimentation with language is very different. I have not paged through the translation.
Mm-hmm.
In the original German, the way that Joyce combines words is actually something he's taking from the German language.
Right.
So in that sense, we do see some mirroring with Schmidt, because the German language can do basically concept coinage. It can do noun coinage very, very easily. And there's all sorts of wild experimentation in language in here. So I shouldn't say unreadable. I should say it's unwieldy, without a doubt.
Because I will say that on Goodreads, the Zettels Traum has a 4.31 out of 5.
Yes.
So it's highly rated with 108 ratings. And so you would assume that many of those ratings are from people who genuinely get a lot out of it, and not just hipsters who are deciding to rate the unrateable. But So clearly there's something in there for people.
I have my bet as to how many of that 108 have read it from the text.
Interesting, yeah.
Because of its size, I'm treating this a lot like Finnegan's Wake in the sense that I pull it off the shelf and read it, but because it's so gigantic, I pull it off a lot less.
Yeah.
I think that's big, its size. If I was like a monk and, texts like this were my everyday, that might be a different story, but it's just so huge that it makes it physically difficult to read.
Well, we'll link out to the Goodreads page and also to your YouTube take on the book.
Yes, yeah, I'll send that along, and if folks want to sign the petition, you don't have to, but I'm just gently trying to.
Please, I'll put the petition in the show notes too. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm trying to gently suggest to the publishers, if you guys want, and I'm not asking for the translation, I'm just asking for the original German to be a little bit more, accessible. The second book, however, I recommend happily. So I have to set this down real quick because it's gigantic and heavy. So the second novel I recommend very happily. Another novel that was, in large part inspired by Finnegan's Wake. And this is one of the most bizarre novels I've read. And I'm putting it right next to there with Finnegan's Wake. And this is actually in my efforts to, finally be fluent in Spanish, my goal is to read this in the original. And this is Terra Nostra by Carlos Fuentes, which in the English is translated from the Spanish into the English by Margaret Sayers Pendon, who is a very good Spanish language translator from Spanish into English. And this novel is bizarre. I think the biggest thing that I can say here is that this novel captures that surrealism we feel when we're reading Finnegan's Wake and cranks it up. It is far more surreal. And just the characters, the situations, everything that's going on here is just so totally bizarre. Fuentes is doing a lot of what Joyce does, where we have very important characters from Spanish novels, Spanish language novels appearing. So from Hopscotch, from Cortázar's Hopscotch, we see characters in there. We see Don Quixote is in here and others. And it is loosely about a Spanish king building his sort of castle complex. And it is sort of on that verge of Enlightenment versus medievalism. But the entirety of it is so confusing and recursive that we see physically in the text of Finnegan's Wake how it starts over, because it starts in the middle of a sentence and ends in the middle of a sentence. The way we see stories told in circles here, you almost intellectually feel the circle beginning, because you start to hear the same narrative again, and then it loops, and you start seeing another person saying the same story but in a different perspective. And it is really, really profound. And Carlos Fuentes, I have to say, a Mexican novelist who did an absolutely fantastic job with Terra Nostra. And I was really, of the sort of postmodernist, post-Joyce novels, Terra Nostra for me is easily the most important. And I would super recommend it to your listeners who are like, I loved Finnegan's Wake. What can I sink my teeth into next that's going to really challenge me? I think Terra Nostra might be the place to go. Nice. Carlos Fuentes. Yeah.
Well, that has a 4.12 on Goodreads, so plenty of people are on board with you. I haven't read it, but that's a great recommendation.
And he is prolific.
Wow.
Oh yeah,
prolific.
Yeah. Fuentes wrote quite a bit, and Terra Nostra. One of the things I love in a novel, or in any piece of art, is playing with time. And Carlos Fuentes in Terra Nostra is on a different plane of existence when it comes to being able to talk about time, and having just that recursive element is really, really astonishing. When I first read it, I actually was like a little put off. And it only after sitting with it, and this how we talked about how a novel or a piece of art can sit with you for a long time.
Mhm.
At first, I was just like, "Oh God, I'm done with this. Get this thing away from me." And then a month later, I was thinking about it. I was like, "Actually, I really loved that."
Mm.
And it started to sit with me. So Terra Nostra, I think that would be one that I would certainly recommend. And this will not cost you $500 to buy. And I say art is for everyone, and I immediately recommend a novel that's $1,000. Don't do that.
Well, maybe you're a member of a very well resourced public library, and then you can find a copy there. You never know.
A public library with a copy of Bottom's Dream would be mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Now, I've seen it in a university library.
Yeah, exactly.
For sure.
Yeah. You don't need to buy every book. You can always take it out of the library. And obviously, in libraries, reader's advisory is a major part of the job, and it's about telling people what to do. And I love the fact that this social media book community is a lot about reader's advisory. It's not just about gatekeeping books, it's about sharing books. And so much is about saying, I have had this experience with this book, you should read it, you may like it, you may not like it, but let's talk about it. And I love that it's the promotion of the social side of things, as opposed to saying, I'm going to collect all of the books and sit on them. I'm not going to talk about them. I'm not going to even read them. I'm going to treat them like trophies.
Yeah.
But the idea of the social side of things and sharing, that's really that's what this podcast became. It started out as just TJ and I making sure that we shamed ourselves into continuing reading it. But in the end, suddenly we had people listening and going, we posted our episode at midnight and I woke up at 7 the next morning and there were 50 listens. And I'm like, what's happening? So then we felt like, okay, we're sharing this and people are along for the ride. One of our friends messaged us just this week and said, having listened to the final episode, which just came out on the Patreon, to say, hey guys, I've just finished reading Finnegan's Wake, because he'd listened to every episode, and I couldn't be happier about that reaction. So yeah, it's about sharing it out there into the world. So that's wonderful. Well, we're going to make sure we link out to all of your materials on YouTube and on Instagram, and to get that information out there. I really strongly recommend everyone check out George's videos. They're very accessible, lots of fun, and a lot of insight into some kind of daunting books that you may not have felt brave enough to take on, but I really feel as though you give us a really good way in.
I appreciate that. Thank you both. Thank you both for having me, and congratulations again. I mean, really, congratulations again on this project. It was really fantastic.
We are just stubborn, if nothing else.
That's actually a very good trait if you want to read Finnegan's Wake. So
I think so. Yeah, we just be dauntless and just go, okay, we're just going to slog through one page at a time, and it's not about understanding it, and it's not about getting every bit, but it's about just enjoying the journey. And I will say, TJ and I are both a little bit sad that it's done. It's what. Yeah.
But one thing I can promise everyone is that one thing Toby and I are very good at are forcing each other to read books that the other one wouldn't have read.
Yeah.
So I have some books coming down the pipe just for Toby to read.
Excellent.
We're already looking at our next literary project, which is not a podcast, but a theatrical adaptation of something that I told myself, I was like, why would I want to adapt that? And then 3 months ago, I was like, maybe I want to adapt that. So, it was a lot of fun. And then in the big stretches where we didn't read, we were like, kind of empty, we're like, oh, we got to get back to this thing. But yeah, I'm pleased.
Yeah, and we're really pleased to have connected with you and to be able to have this little crossover between your YouTube channel and our podcast. And thank you so much for reaching out and asking to come on, because it's been a real pleasure to have you.
Yeah, it's been great, and I look forward to seeing what happens next. I'm anxiously awaiting whatever this adaptation is.
Well, you know what? I'll tell people. I told Toby I got a wild hair, and I was like, I wonder what it would be like to adapt Uncle Vanya. So that's the next goal, is to adapt
in the world now.
Uncle Vanya.
Yeah.
But also I made the listeners a promise that I would write an audio play starring Festy King.
Okay.
So I gotta figure. Here's the issue with that. Now I have to go through and be like, what are all the instances of Festy King, and what does he do?
Well, that's what you have a dramaturg for.
Very true.
That's my job. Don't worry about that.
Very true.
Yeah.
I'm like,
and I will say that with Uncle Vanya, I played Astroff at university. That was the show that I met my wife on. So I feel very strongly connected to Uncle Vanya. So I'm looking forward to our adaptation. So anyway, that is all the time we have this week for Wake. For now, this feed will go silent for the first time in nearly a year. So if you're in the habit of checking out your weekly Wake fix, might I suggest you go listen to Michael Ian Black's Obscure, or TJ's Grown Men Watch Kid Stuff, or look at George's many videos to keep yourself busy while you wait for us to come up with a new one. We will likely return for extra episodes in the months to come as the inspiration strikes us, so don't unsubscribe to this feed. Anything new that comes out will at least be advertised here. If we have something different coming, or if we have something that's connected to Finnegan's Wake, it will stay here. So stay on board.
King will appear here.
That's right. But while you're waiting for us, I'd love for you to consider giving us a rating on your podcast app, 5 stars only, please. And a review is even better. So we love the reviews. It helps people find us. And all of our reviews, you can review us on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts and on IMDb, lots of different places. You can also check out our YouTube channel where we have video versions of all of our podcasts. Thank you again for all of your incredible support of Wake and the work that we do. Thank you, George Koors, for being here with us. We really loved having you here.
It has been a pleasure, guys. So great meeting you both.
Absolutely, you too. And we'll see you on the next steps. See you soon, true believers. This has been Wake, a cold reading of James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, just to hear it out loud. If you've made it this far, thank you for your dedication. Join us next week for another segment of Finnegan's Wake and a chat about what we've found. Wake is a Moon Street Media podcast, engineered by TJ Young and Toby Malone. Our theme song is The Ballad of Perso Riley, arranged and performed by Meg Logue after James Joyce. Wake is recorded in Canada, where Finnegan's Wake is in the public domain. For community and bonus content, join us at our free Patreon at patreon.com/wakepod. If you have questions about Finnegan's Wake, don't ask us. We're just as confused as you are. See you next week.